All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are on chapters 4 to 6 of Revolution and Counter Revolution by Oliveira. And today we're thinking about what the real roots of the revolution are. In the last session on this book, we looked at the fact that all the crises in the West today are fundamentally one crisis, ultimately, which is concerning man himself. So these have metaphysical roots. Mike, what really struck you from last lesson?
What struck me from last lesson, I guess, two points. One is that he essentially makes or develops the thesis that there's a continuous revolution that has taken on various forms from the Protestant Reformation through the French Revolution to Marxist communism, and that these are crests of a wave of a more foundational revolution that's continued to occur since Luther and the breaking away from papal authority, and the attack on the king in France, and then the attack on the bourgeoisie in communist revolutions they're the same instantiation of attacking hierarchy and attacking any type of inegalitarian elements of the world. And then the second element, I would say, is that the way by which the revolution, capital R, continues or is perpetuated is by the constant inflaming of vicious tendencies, particularly of the body and of pride. So sensuality and pride are really the engines that continue the revolution.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And we'll be looking at more at that concept today. Let's begin with our prayer so that we can do a good job of hopefully explaining these ideas with clarity. And people watching, please join us. Come, Holy
Father,
Spirit,
Son, Holy Spirit.
divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you, the Father, forever and ever. Amen. We like this prayer, as we say every week, because it acknowledges that original sin wounds us in intellect and in will, and sin can make you stupid. So we're asking for help here so that we get grace to enlighten our intellects so we can do a good job of studying. This is Aquinas' student's prayer, and I would highly recommend that you pray it yourself when you're studying at home. All right, now we just did a quick recap on the fact that ultimately what we see unless you're hiding your head under a rock for the last 10, 20 years, what we see around us today with the woke revolution isn't really fundamentally something new. It's just yet another manifestation of this single fundamental crisis, which Oliveira traces all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, and then links to fundamental questions about sin. So Mike just gave a really great, clear outline of how this works. And we're thinking about how disordered tendencies are what ultimately are at the root of it. It's even controversial now to talk about disorder, isn't it?
Oh, correct. That's gets you labeled an ist or phobe, or any reference to order at all is presuming that there's some objective reality and it's contrary to somebody else's subjective, their truth. Might be their truth that being morbidly obese is healthy. How you who are you to judge? So any notion of either a moral or normative order, or really just a objective reality at all, is now contrary to the radical relativism that seems to just be everywhere in the culture.
And yet people, despite that radical relativism, which is only really a short step away from nihilism, like, why does anything really matter at all if it's all relative? Despite this, people will say things like, hey, don't be homophobic. That's wrong. Hey, you must respect women. Hey, racism is wrong. Hey,
You
don't
ought not
lie.
judge. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be discriminatory. So it seems that despite all the talk about anything goes, go with the flow, you do you, make your own meaning, there still is this sense that we do have standards. And you've often picked out how this is incoherent.
Yeah, it's totally incoherent. They'll help themselves to moral relativism in one moment and then use that as an explanation as to why we ought to tolerate everybody. It's just like, well, look, if everything's up for grab, then so aren't intolerance views. So you're gonna have to account for that somehow.
Right.
And yeah,
That's Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. Nothing is true, all is permitted.
yeah,
Few people willing to try to live that one out consistently. And there's also the ultimate problem that if nothing is true, then are you offering us that as the truth?
yeah, exactly. The self-referential incoherence. There's a moral version of it, then there's just a propositional version of it that cuts even deeper.
Right. Now, being Catholic, we think that order is very much an objective thing. And sin fundamentally is acting in a way that is contrary to reason. And human beings, as rational animals, can understand what the right way to act is. And this involves the pursuit of knowledge and virtue and living according to natural law. We often have used the example of the tiger who does tiger things and thereby lives a flourishing life. He doesn't have to think about this. He just has his instinct that tells him what he's supposed to do.
Mhm.
But we can understand, for example, why truth is a good thing for us to pursue. We can understand why we should do our duties.
Yeah, this is rationality and morality end up becoming close cousins of one another and operating in parallel. And yeah, so what's the good is good for us, and rationality is good for us because that's where the type of being that is ordered towards truth.
Sure. So once we've acknowledged then that really, in its essence, sin is irrational action. So acting in a way that is contrary to natural law. This isn't a good thing for us, and it manifests in disordered social structures too. So when we looked at Plato, he had some good insights into how the city is basically the soul writ large. And we can get all kinds of spiritual disorder, and then that manifests in disordered regimes.
Yeah, that sounds like exactly where we are right now. That
And
just
this
seems
is
to have
what
predicted it.
that's it, yeah. And this is what de Oliveira means when he says that when we think about what drives the revolution, it's disordered tendencies. These have consequences. People talk a lot about the idea of a social construct now. But the point is that society itself is natural to man. Because we're the rational animal, we need other people. We need a community. We don't get everything we need transmitted to us via our genes. So, like a baby crocodile, when he's out of the egg, can pretty much survive.
Mm.
He can hunt. He can catch things within seconds. And you haven't got to teach him things about virtue. You haven't got to teach him things about algebra. You haven't got to teach him abstract concepts. He doesn't need that. He's a croc. He knows what to do. But with human beings, the process of education involves culture, which isn't just genetic.
Yeah, certainly.
So the big problem then, and it's a potent combination, as we mentioned, is that we've got an explosion of pride and sensuality. You mentioned these two things earlier. Do you want to just say a little bit more about why, if you were to dream up the ideal way to try to derail people, these would be up there on your list, probably your top two?
Yeah, certainly. If we accept that there is a God and a natural order to which God has made us oriented, and that the will and intellect, when they are aligned with those sort of prefix grooves, and we've subordinated our will and our passions to that, then overall things are going to go well individually and collectively. If you start pumping up the ego to believe that the individual is greater than God and that can make his own rules, and that the appetites and passions should be valued over the will, and then you run that game, or you run that iteration across individuals and collectively over a long enough time, that it looks like a sure recipe for bedlam and for ruin.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what it is. And when we're thinking about why these are such powerful inducements to disorder, pride is described as being the beginning of all sin. Adam and Eve sinned through pride in desiring to be like God in knowledge. So really it's about the disordered desire for personal excellence. So you've got that emphasis on autonomy and doing things your own way. And for fallen man, the idea that you have to subject yourself to someone else's standard and rules and way of doing things, that's a tough pill for us to swallow, isn't it? That we don't get to make our own rules.
It's a tough pill to swallow, and then I would say, particularly within the West, when you've seen the dangers of people going along with like the mob or the collective, right? There's an initial like overcorrection to think like, well, I won't join anything. I won't, I'll just be this radical, atomized individual. Like any and all order or organization or rules outside of my own sovereign decision making is somehow just radically suspect. I think that might be informing or in the equation as well.
Right. I think you're right. Certainly in recent years. And regarding sensuality, we've got the fact that sex is obviously one of the most intense pleasures in human life, and it's a really strong desire because it's connected to the preservation of the race. So it's there as an instinct, but it was particularly affected by the fall. Concupiscence is disordered desire, and it touches sex most of all, closely followed by the pleasures of eating. Aquinas says those two are most likely to become disordered, and people looking around now thinking about the problems of obesity in modern culture, but also promiscuity, post-sexual revolution especially. It's not hard to see that that was a good insight. These two things are especially prone to disorder. And it fascinates me that you get, even on the side of the radicals, somebody like Engels, for example, noting to Marx that it's a curious thing that whenever the question of political revolution comes about, the question of free love is right there beside it. So Engels just observed and said, hey, look, whenever we get these political uprisings, we've also got free love coming too. Now, I can think of one reason why that should obviously be the case, given that the family is the fundamental or original social cell. Do you think that makes sense?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. It's like the I don't know, like that that single building block is suddenly just being um, erased or exploded apart
Yeah,
by the yeah, the sexual revolutionary like acid.
that's it. So we were thinking last time about the way in which fundamentally this revolution is an assault on God the Father with a capital F, and also the patriarch too,
Hmm.
father with a lowercase f in the family, but also
Yep.
the king as the extended father of the nation.
Hmm. Yep.
And sensuality is involved in the root of that, with the rebellion against paternal authority in particular, because the feminists explicitly identified the monogamous marriage bond as the main thing to attack, to weaken the position of the patriarch, and that promiscuity was the way to do this.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah. That's looks like it worked. It has been working.
Yeah, for sure. And we said a few words there about original sin and how it affects the intellect and the will. And de Oliveira talks about how in fallen man there is a weakness of the intelligence and a first tendency to rebel against the law. What were your thoughts about this insight? I thought it was a good one.
Yeah, I thought so as well. Gets back to our Aquinas prayer at the beginning. That sin makes you stupid, and the more one's rationality is weakened or clouded or distracted by disordered appetites, then you're not going to be able to reason clearly, and you're going to be likely to rebel more because you don't understand what it is that you're actually destroying, and like the full implications are lost in the act.
Right. And this also reminds us that we are inclined towards disorder. It's hard work to make things work, but it's easy for things to go wrong. Most
Mm-hmm.
people recognize this from things like exercise and diet, whatever it might be. But what the revolution is really doing, in Jolivera's view here, is unleashing what are some very difficult to control passions and essentially giving them free reign. And that's how we bring chaos about. And here are his remarks on pride and sensuality from last time, just to recap on this. Pride leads to hatred of all superiority, and thus to the affirmation that inequality is an evil in itself at all levels, principally at the metaphysical and religious ones. So just note there that this is ultimately a metaphysical and religious phenomenon at its core. This is the egalitarian aspect of the revolution. So that's thing number one, egalitarian. Sensuality, per se, tends to sweep aside all barriers. It does not accept restraints and leads to revolt against all authority and law, divine or human, ecclesiastical or civil. This is the liberal, thing number two, aspect of the revolution. So we've got egalitarian and liberal, pride and sensuality. And that was from the previous chapters, but I think this particular quote you've selected here about the weakness of the intelligence and the tendency to rebel is a nice way of encapsulating that double insight from the previous chapters. Does that make more sense now, seeing that encapsulated here?
Oh, certainly, yeah. How those, yeah, both those elements take on those two different forms. Yeah, both vices express themselves in the uh, whatever the disordered versions of those two values.
Yeah. And you can see there how sensuality is most connected to the liberal aspect of the revolution because sexual liberalism is the spearhead of all liberalism, which is what Engels is talking about when he says that, look how these two things go together. When we see political revolution, we see sexual revolution too. So he's arrived at the same insight, although it's from the opposite side of the political spectrum.
Yes.
Now, it's a quick recap historically of the three phases of this prior to our own manifestation of it that you outlined at the start. De Oliveira starts by looking at the 14th century, and he says we get a transformation of mentality in Christian Europe that becomes even more apparent during the 15th century. What is it? The thirst for earthly pleasures became a burning desire. Then he notes how humanism and the Renaissance frequently sought to relegate the church, the supernatural, and the moral values of religion to a secondary plane. What takes their place? What becomes primary? Pride and sensuality. And the satisfaction of these is the pleasure of pagan life. That's why we get a return to antiquity as the ideal, pre-Christian antiquity. And he says that ultimately this gives rise to Protestantism. Pride begot the spirit of doubt, free examination, and naturalistic interpretation of Scripture. It produced insurrection against ecclesiastical authority. We've described Protestantism as basically liberalism in religious form. I don't need any priests. I'll figure it out myself. I'm autonomous. Right. You've got no authority over me. And then this ends in the you do you 39,000 plus Protestant sects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So that's the pride side of it. On the moral plane, the triumph of sensuality in Protestantism was affirmed by, this is a great insight, the suppression of ecclesiastical celibacy and by the introduction of divorce. Let's pause on those for a second. Priests don't have to be celibate anymore. If you look at Luther's problems with lust, for example, you can see why this would be an attractive thing. You can also see why it would be an attractive thing to believe you haven't got any free will.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That is interesting. Yeah.
I've forgotten which church father it was, but one of them had this great line that there are no chaste heretics.
That's funny. Yeah.
It's so funny. I've got to find out who it was, but brilliant. Yeah, no chaste heretics. So priests no longer have to be celibate. I mean, that makes things a lot easier, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
What a convenient demand to be able to get rid of. And the introduction of divorce. Now, how's that related to sensuality?
Well, yeah, it opens up more options for transactional relationships and chasing of more sensual variety. Yeah.
That's it. And Louis de Bonald, the French counter-revolutionary writer, in his work on divorce, he makes the really good point that it's actually even more damaging to society than polygyny or multiple wives is, because what you get is essentially polygyny in the form of serial monogamy. So I can just have as many wives as I want, one after the next. It's basically multiple wives. But unlike the Muslims, my kids don't get the stability of there being one family because we get separated each time. So Bonald says the West is thinking, oh, look at them with their multiple wives. Isn't that barbaric? No, divorce is more barbaric than multiple wives.
Yeah, because of the turnover and the increasing instability. Yeah.
That's it. So I'm doing some work on that book at the moment, and it's amazing how he saw so clearly why divorce was instrumental and why it was such a great weapon against the authority of the fathers. And he was talking then about the fact that women are the ones who often instigate it, far more so than men do, and how this is the way of undermining patriarchal authority. So John Oliveira doesn't talk about it much in the book, unless I've missed it, but it's another manifestation of this same crisis in that it's rebellion against the authority of the husband.
Right.
Right, small sidetrack there, but it was worth it. Just to recap what we're talking about. So the priests no longer have to be celibate and people can get divorced. This is how we see sensualism coming out in the Protestant Reformation. Okay, then he says that the French Revolution is the heir of Renaissance neo-paganism and of Protestantism, and it's got a really profound affinity with them. He says that some of the sects arising from Protestantism transposed their religious tendencies directly to the political field, thus preparing the way for the Republican spirit. Now, I'm hoping that people who might not have understood fully what you meant at the start, when you said that this is ultimately just different waves of the same thing, can now grasp it with these historical illustrations. Because what I like about John Oliveira's book is he's concise and he picks out good illustrations, good examples to show this underlying impetus behind all the different phenomena.
Yeah. He's very good and very succinct at connecting these dots.
So the Republican spirit then has behind it the spirit of Protestantism, and we've also got the French Revolutionary spirit and Renaissance neo-paganism. What comes next? The 19th century schools of utopian communism and the so-called scientific communism of Marx burst forth from the increasingly ardent spirit of the revolution. So they're yet another manifestation of this same basic. I just completely cut for a second. Of this same basic flow behind all of it. Okay, good. So that's a quick historical recap. In like progression, errors beget errors, and revolutions prepare the way for revolutions. Tell me a bit about this. Errors beget errors.
Sounds very much like Aquinas's. I'm sorry. I'm hearing myself now. It's a bit distracting. No, I'm good now. It sounds a lot like Aquinas's errors in the beginning lead to large errors at the end. So yeah, you can think this compounding of fissures or compounding of like 1 or 2 degrees off from the natural order and the natural law, iterating from the Protestant Reformation through the French Revolution, and then being this snowball of errors being inherited by your 19th century communist thinkers. And it's just one error on top of another.
Good way to describe it. And I'm just wondering how, if error begets errors, what we see now is the most extreme version of it so far, like the most erroneous. If it's snowballing, then we should be seeing things now that are enough to wake up some people who maybe thought things weren't too bad previously. Do you think that's the case?
I think so. I mean, it's what's Hemingway in what is it, The Sun Also Rises or somewhere where it says gradually then suddenly. So yeah, I think that the suddenly right now is LGBTQ plus, etc. But that, contrary to the Jordan Peterson, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay view, the madness of wokeism and transgenderism, etc., it isn't because some pissed off Marxists in the 60s took over the universities, right? It's not that simple. It's rather it's the long symptom of centuries of these errors finally hitting a crescendo, hitting an acceleration point that has been building up through centuries of errors.
Yeah. You're not going to wind back the clock to 1990 and
Hmm.
then everything's going to be fine. You
Yep.
can't wind it back to 1950 and have it all be fine either. I know some people take that view that, oh, we've just taken one step too far. And if we
Mhm.
can just dial it back a little bit, maybe get the trans people to go away, then things will be okay again.
We'll
No,
just get the neo-Marxists out of the universities, and then we'll be good to go. It's like, no, the substratum upon which all of this is founded, that itself is collapsing.
what you were seeing is, if not the last stop that the crazy train arrives at, probably the penultimate one, or maybe anti-penultimate one. And if you get off and walk back up the track a bit and get on the train again, you're coming back here because this is the track.
You're coming back here. This is the track, and it's for me, anyways. It really, in responding and trying to make sense of a lot of this, it really shows a lot of the poverty of your libertarian views, where that puts you right back on the train too. You know, well, I'm just going to be the New Hampshire pot smoking libertarian guy that don't touch my guns. Doesn't matter. Like you're still going to get swept up in this undercurrent of of revolution and that direction of travel. Hence woke capital.
Correct. And just to give an example of that for people so they can understand it better, what you mean there. If autonomy is the inner citadel of liberalism, it's the core value of it. The trans man just wants autonomy from biology. He just wants
Mm-hmm.
to live his life
Mm-hmm.
and not hurt anyone and see himself how he sees fit and make his own meaning. And he is just appealing to the same fundamental liberal premises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And Oliveira, to my mind anyway, better than anybody else that I've read, shows how that's ultimately just a form of pride in not accepting your status as a creature, not
Mm-hmm.
accepting your duties towards others, not accepting this idea of authority and the common good, and trying to make yourself the center of your own life.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so you began by talking about Aquinas, paraphrasing Aristotle, how small mistakes in the beginning lead to big ones in the end. And we related that to the concept of errors begetting errors, and how this most recent manifestation of this underlying crisis is the worst one yet. Nobody else has had pregnant men before. Yeah.
As far as I could tell, no. I mean, that seems to be a unique gem of the 21st century West that we can we can take pride in having created.
And there will probably be some kind of AI transhumanist manifestation after that as well.
Yeah,
Logically, there's no reason why there shouldn't be.
exactly.
Trans speciesism is the thing that will
Mhm.
come next.
Yeah.
Okay, what do we do? How can we avoid errors begetting errors? Now, here is a very old fashioned and challenging thought. The intelligence illuminated by grace and guided by shock, horror, authority, the magisterium of the
Mm.
church. This is the thing that we thought we didn't need right at the beginning with the Protestant Reformation.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It turns out that we did that. The spinal column of Western civilization is that it's the Catholic Church, and it's the magisterium and tradition. And once you untether yourself, once you're unmoored from that reference point, you end up a pregnant man.
Ultimately, you do. Europe is the faith, and the faith is Europe, as Hilaire Belloc said. And what we're really looking at here with Jolivera's remark that we need grace and we need the magisterium is that by ourselves, we can't get much done. This is why pride doesn't like this idea. So the intellect is darkened and sin only makes it darker. And there's no society possible without authority. And
Mm.
because Protestantism was liberalism in religious form, this is where we see the ideas really starting and fermenting. And then they spread into the political sphere as well from the religious one.
Mm.
And ultimately, the economic one. People don't like this point, but laissez faire capitalism is just economic liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I think the assumption that everything can be everything can be turned into a market or become a commodified element underpins a lot of economic, liberal laissez-faire economic theories, and it just turns out metaphysically it can't. You like persons just aren't the type of thing that are for sale. Friendship is not it's not the kind of thing that I can like buy friendship. I can't have a friend and then trade one friend for two friends and two friends for four friends and then four friends for eight friends. It's like I've missed it destroys the very constitutive element of what it is to have a friend. You don't have a friend at that point if you can just buy and swap out friends. You've missed the concept.
What if you just have no friends and buy a sex doll?
that's where we're heading, right? That's where we are.
That's
So,
it. That's
target for
exactly it.
everything.
Sadly, like we said again, the train is heading to Crazy Town, but you can get off. You can get off and watch the people who want to stay on. You
Yeah.
can't save them. That's not your job. That's for Jesus to do. But you can definitely get off. So the next concept I found really interesting was that he says that the more disordered desires are satisfied, the more intense they become. He actually used
Mm-hmm.
the analogy of like an itch where you scratch it and you just want to scratch it even more.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Makes sense given what we've just been saying about the snowballing and the errors begetting errors.
It does, and I think it also, I guess, in like contemporary psychology, they'd refer to it as whatever the hedonic treadmill. So you see this with like addiction behavior, where the first dose of cocaine is great, but then they hit a leveling off, and then you need more, and you need more, and you need more, and then whatever till somebody's an addict or they die. And so you see a similar. I think our appetites are just like that if we're not actively keeping them in order.
And this is why traditionally the church has said that sin is slavery, because
Mm-hmm.
every time you give in to an impulse like that, you give it power over you, which is why
Mm-hmm.
the traditional recommendations about fasting, mortification, etc., these are all about strength and freedom.
Yeah, and it's also why you just see so many celebrities just end up in these just awful situations because there's no governing device to prevent them from just having more and more and more, and it's never there's never enough of whatever the thing is.
That's it. Well, the reason for that is that all these forms of disorder, and thinking about the seven deadly sins anyway, sin fundamentally is about putting something where God should be. And you've got
Mm.
the craving for the infinite. So the fornicator can never sleep with enough women because he's made that his idol and it
Mm.
can't satisfy him. The glutton can never eat enough or get expensive enough steak or whatever it might be. He always wants more.
Mm. Mm.
So yeah,
Yep.
that point about it being an attempt to slake the thirst for the infinite, I think, is an important one to bear in mind. Thinking about why Protestantism is important, he relates it to anarchic yearnings. I like the phrase anarchic yearnings.
Mm.
Could you say a few words about why that concept of the anarchic yearning ties up many of the ideas we've mentioned so far about disorder? What ultimately is it that's anarchic here? Protestantism says no to what?
They say no to rightly ordered hierarchical authority. and in the form of the magisterium. And you see that same yearning to break away and to then destroy or undermine hierarchy. It manifests itself in secular form in various strains of communism. So ultimately, yeah, it's rightly ordered hierarchy, first spiritual and then secular, is sort of the iterations that we see here.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was hoping you're going to make there. So it's anarchy opposed to hierarchy. That's the fundamental root conflict. What do we make then of the fact that Oliveira points out that sometimes you get people who want to bring about change really quickly, the extremists. He says the explosion of extremisms raises a standard and creates a fixed target. Now, this reminded me of the concept of the Overton window.
Yeah.
So you've got people thinking, well, I'm not quite ready for pregnant men yet. The whole trans thing's a bit too much for me, but I kind of like the ideas behind it. I'm sympathetic to people being able to just do their own thing, live their own way. And I can see that the direction of travel is good. So this has given me some ideas. Maybe we do need to make some changes.
Well, it's just I think that's correct. The Overton window point, and I think most people too. It's like they instinctively just think that some appeal to the center is always good. So it ends up being this perversion of Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. But then you have these radicals, vanguardists, that if they take it as their sole purpose to push the boundary and push the Overton window further. So then, even if you have folks that they're not on board with that direction of travel or that bleeding edge vanguardist claim, it nonetheless resets the center. And then they go, well, hey, I'm just don't look at me. I'm just a moderate. But what they fail to recognize is that because of these extremist and vanguardist movements, the center, it's always shifting. So appeals to centrism of both the political left and variety, it just ends up being a de facto getting in line with the direction of travel of, well, okay, fine, I'll accept pregnant men eventually, just not now.
Yeah. When he says that it creates a target, what he means is that the moderates are attracted to it. They're almost magnetized to it. So it becomes the new goal. And I like the example he gave of the Anabaptists creating a target for Protestantism. And for people who haven't heard of this before, the first traces of the Baptists appeared in 1521. Luther began the Protestant revolt against the Catholic Church in 1517. But then a gentleman named Thomas Munzer in 1521, he sets up as a prophet on his own account. And he says, Luther has not gone far enough. We need to abolish more ideas. So he teaches that nobody who had been baptized as an infant was really baptized at all. So everyone who followed him had to be baptized again. So that's why his followers got the name Anabaptists, or the re-baptizers. Now, it failed. Didn't really take on, but it created a target for Protestantism. He was showing what could be done. Why don't we take it even further than Luther did? That's an idea. And people saw it, they were inspired, and then the window gets shifted. So the failure can still have a strong impact for this reason.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
The other interesting point he makes is that sometimes you get lulls. Everything seems fine. And you could argue that after the sexual revolution of the 1960s, maybe we do get a lull. When would you say the trans stuff really kicked off?
Yeah, 2015 with Bruce Jenner being declared Woman of the Year, I would think is probably
When he hadn't been
groundbreaking.
a woman for a year yet.
Yeah, I was going to say every every element of, of that claim was false.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is why people think that if we could just wind back the clock to maybe like, I don't know, the 80s or the 90s, things
Right.
would be
Yeah.
pretty good. Um, no, de Oliveira says that the revolutionary movement feigns death. And this is about it being opposed. It's fake. And he says that actually the times of silence are times of ferment. They're the most dangerous. So it's when beneath the surface, things are bubbling and getting ready
Mm,
to go again in a more extreme way.
right. Yeah.
Lulls you into a false sense of security. And the people who should be resisting the attack don't. They get weak. They
Mm,
let their guard down. And it's at that point that you can take more ground.
hmm Yeah. Sounds right. Sounds like human nature.
That's it. Yeah. So you let your guard down during times of comfort, and then the enemy gets an advantage on you. Let's think about this in terms of Gramsci's idea about institutional
Mm,
capture as well, the means of cultural production. People scratching their heads now saying, oh, look what's happened to the Ivy League. Look what's happened to this prestigious school here, there, everywhere. How did that happen?
yeah, it happened because the West stopped believing in anything affirmative and let a lot of weeds grow in the garden while they were, I guess, taking it easy.
That's it. And the victim narrative version of this that people will give, and I've interviewed E. Michael Jones and took the hit in the press about this, is people will say, the Jews did it. Blame the Jews. But that's not a good reason to give, because whatever arguments you might make about that, and E. Michael Jones has got some people can make their own minds up about it. Why did it work? Why were you susceptible to any kind of subversion?
Mhm.
Because you sinned in the first place, because you're weak.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you've made this point. Like, strong cultures don't get subverted. They don't get. There's not a. They're not chinks in the armor. There's not like gaps or power vacuums that get filled with other ideological or political commitments.
Right. And this, so E. Michael Jones's big point was pointing out what's been discussed openly by the Jews themselves about ownership of porn companies, for example. But who funds them? The West does.
Who's addicted to them? Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's no good trying to blame somebody else. It comes back to what we were talking about earlier with pride and sensuality and being weakened by sin. Vice ultimately destroys.
Yep.
Now, this next set of concepts I really liked. He gives some examples of different kinds of people in their responses to this. He talks about the slow speed revolutionary who experiences some clots. And what he means by this is basically resistance due to specific details. So
Mm,
let's say you're pretty sympathetic to socialism, but you also kind of like aristocratic manners. Some of the old traditions
mm,
still appeal to you. That's going
yep.
to make you a slow speed revolutionary because you're not willing to let go yet. Can you think of any examples of people like that?
Yeah. So Bernie Sanders, his crew of folks, oddly, they were like socialists, but they were resistance to the trans type folks. So that created a fissure within that camp. Like they were sort of old school communist economic Marxists, but they got in the crosshairs of the LGBT folks because a lot of them were like straight white men that just that just wanted economic communism, and that wasn't good enough. So into the cannibalization began.
That's it. So the clot is when you've got something that you're hanging on to still, but it's not really about a fundamental principle. It's just something you happen to like, a minor detail. So then he says that the next kind of person we get is the semi-counter revolutionary. And they experience what he calls coagulation. And this is because their resistance is actually based on some principles. Not all principles, but some of them.
This reminded me of like you're like Con Inc. type folks, right?
Yeah, say more about that. I think that's really important.
I mean, this idea of like conservative Inc., where it's, I mean, maybe you're intellectual dark web folks, you're folks that are secular humanists, but they believe in constitutional contractualism or free speech absolutism, but there's no real theological or deeper cultural like undergirding to why those commitments are there. Those folks, you know, their challenge, or like Dave Rubin might be an instance of this, right? Like he's a gay-based conservative pundit. Douglas Murray might be in that camp as well. So they're anti-wokeism. They're for like economic conservatism, but then that's about it. And then, as the saying goes, you know, these are conservatives that fail to conserve anything. And the reason why is because, yeah, there's a coagulation of principles against the direction of travel of the revolution, but it's still ultimately, it's only a semi-counter-revolutionary disposition.
Right, exactly. And in the examples you just gave there, they've conceded the crucial ground in so many areas.
Yeah,
I would argue that a based gay is a contradiction in terms.
Exactly, yeah.
So this is why you're never more than a semi-counter-revolutionary. But de Oliveira does say that they are open, possibly, to offering full resistance against the revolution if crystallization occurs. And I think this is an important concept because it happens now, perhaps more so than it did in the past. The coagulation in the semi-counter-revolutionary can, de Oliveira says, in response to an extreme from the revolution, crystallize into full resistance. Now, didn't this happen to you? Weren't you at one point semi-counter-revolutionary, and then trans basically was your crystallization? You thought, that's it, enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's because I kept watching every other supposed like defender against this pernicious ideology. It just came one by one. It just bent the knee, and yeah, you're just watching everything become either de dicto or de facto trans. And so it's that's was a big galvanizing force in my life for considering, well, you know, there's like 3 institutions left that dare say that men can't get pregnant. And it's like trad Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, and Muslims. So like the truth has to be somewhere there. Otherwise, it's just everything else is just de facto trans.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe some good will come of this and that will happen to more people. But what it truly involves to crystallize into full resistance is, at minimum, wholesale rejection of the sexual revolution. And if you understand what Wilhelm Reich put in his book by that name, you can see why the weaponization of sensuality, for the reasons that de Oliveira outlines, was so crucial as the spearhead of the whole thing for this latest manifestation. And for young guys who are frustrated by contemporary culture, if you're crystallizing, one of the big things that you need to understand full resistance against is required for is unmarried sex. That's one of the main things that they wanted to bring about, because they knew what it meant for damaging the family and also impact on society at large. You've also got homosexuality, especially homosexual marriage. Crystallization involves opposition to those two, and questioning the entire liberal outlook as well, including laissez-faire capitalism. So it's a coming to terms with the fact that authority in all kinds of ways, all kinds of areas of life, is actually a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good thing because it's a true thing.
And no society is possible without it, which is why so-called liberal regimes have this oddly consistent habit historically of turning into tyrannies.
Yep.
If you want to know more about that, have a look at the interview I did of Dr. James Kalb, who wrote a book, The Tyranny of Liberalism, exploring just that phenomenon. Okay, slow speed clots, semi-counter revolutionary coagulation, possible to crystallize into full resistance. What do we have at the center of all these things then? He says you might think that there's disunity among the revolutionaries, but think again, because it's only illusory. The disunity is illusory. The revolutionary forces are only truly efficient in evil. Thus, each of them from its own side attacks the church, which becomes like a city besieged by an immense army. Now, for me, when I was moving from, how would I describe it? A kind of atheism / Nietzschean agnosticism, classical theism to Christianity. This was one of the main things that, for me, was a mark of the truth of the Catholic claim, because who's enemy number one?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The Catholic Church. It would make sense that if one was animated by this rebellious and revolutionary spirit, then the number one pillar that you need to take out has to be the tradition and the magisterium of the Catholic Church. That would logically be your number one target to subvert.
And also, another proof of the Catholic claim is that despite all the enemies at her gates, we don't see any attempt to actually change what the doctrine is. And it's amazing to me that so many people will say, how can you be a Catholic? Look at this thing that Pope Francis has said recently about gay sex, for example, how it shouldn't be illegal anywhere. But the catechism is unchanged. And even Pope Francis backtracked a bit and clarified, saying, no, it's still a sin. Like, don't get me wrong. You know, gay sex is a sin. Just because the media got too excited. So even someone as arguably sympathetic in many ways to some elements of the revolutionary impetus as Pope Francis hasn't been able to change what the church's teaching is. So you've got this massive attack and also resistance to it, standing strong.
Yep. Yep. Also what you'd expect.
That's right. So the two things together are good evidence that this needs to be taken seriously. Now, in subsequent chapters, de Oliveira talks about why the only possible response to this is an increase in authority. And he talks basically about a counter-revolutionary dictatorship, temporary suspension of rights for the sake of the restoration of order, which will make people feel uncomfortable, but he gives clear reasons why it's necessary. And unlike the revolution, which aims at continuing itself, so trying to sustain itself, he says that the counter-revolutionary dictatorship just seeks to get the job done and then end itself, so we can return to proper order and hierarchy and subsidiarity. So I think the next sections will be really interesting, thinking about why the response to the poison of liberalism needs this approach and nothing else is going to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. Thanks for your time today. Enjoyed it. Really good insights.
Same here, as always.
Take care. See you soon.
Same here. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.